The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. Printing and publishing were generally united in the same firm, and the man or family that engaged in them was a vital factor in his town and times. Fame through printing alone was rare. Claude Garamond of Paris managed it by discarding the Gothic type that German printers had adopted from manuscript lettering, and designing, circa 1540, a Roman type based on the Carolingian minuscule script of the 9th century as developed by Italian humanists and the Aldine press. Italian, French, and English printers chose this Roman form. The Germans clung to Gothic till the 19th century. Some styles of type still bear Garamond's name. Germany led the world in publishing. There were active firms in Basel, Strasbourg, Augsburg, Nuremberg, Wittenberg, Cologne, Leipzig, Frankfurt, and Magdeburg. Twice a year, publishers and booksellers met at the Frankfurt Fair, bought and sold books, and exchanged ideas. One Frankfurt printer issued the first newspaper in 1548, a sheet distributed at the fair and reporting recent events. Antwerp became a publishing centre when Christopher Plantin turned his bindery into a print shop in 1555. 2 years later, he sent 1,200 volumes to the Frankfurt Fair. In France, the hub of the book trade was Lyon. 200 printing establishments made the city challenge Paris as the intellectual capital of the land. Etienne Dolet, printer and humanist, was the firebrand of Lyon. Born in Orléans, schooled in Paris, he fell in love with Cicero. "I approve only of Christ and Tully." Hearing that thought was exceptionally free at Padua, he hurried there and exchanged irreverent epigrams with skeptical Averroists. At Toulouse, he became the soul of a free-thinking band that laughed at papists and Lutherans alike. Banished, he went to Lyon and made a name for himself with poems and articles, but he killed a painter in an argument and fled to Paris, where Marguerite of Navarre won him a pardon from the king. He became friends and quarreled with Marot and Rabelais. Returning to Lyon, he set up a printing press and specialized in publishing heretical works. The Inquisition summoned him, tried him, imprisoned him. He escaped, but was captured on a clandestine visit to his son. On August 3, 1546, he was burned alive. The most distinguished of French publishers were the Etiennes, a dynasty as persistent in printing as the Fugers in finance. Henri Etienne started his press at Paris about 1500. It was continued by his sons, Francis, Robert, and Charles. To these four, France owed her finest editions of the Greek and Latin classics. Robert compiled a Thesaurus Linguae Latinae in 1532, which became the leaning post for all later Latin-French dictionaries. To the Etiennes, Latin became a second tongue. They regularly spoke it in their family life. Francis I praised their work, supported Marguerite in defending them against the Sorbonne, and on one occasion joined the coterie of scholars that met in Robert's shop. A famous story tells how the king waited patiently while Robert corrected an urgent proof. Francis provided the funds with which Robert engaged Garamond to design and cast a new font of Greek type, so beautiful that it became the model of most later printing in Greek. The Sorbonne disapproved of the king's flirtation with Hellenism. A professor warned Parlement in 1539 that to propagate a knowledge of Greek and Hebrew would operate to the destruction of all religion. As for Hebrew, said a monk, it was well known that all who learn Hebrew presently become Jews. After being harassed by the Sorbonne for 30 years, Robert transferred his press to Geneva in 1552, and there, in the year of his death in 1559, he revealed his Protestant inclinations by publishing an edition of Calvin's Institutes. His son, Henri Etienne II, upheld the repute of the family by issuing in Paris handsome editions of the classics and compiling in 5 volumes a Thesaurus Linguae Graecae in 1572, which is still the most complete of all Greek dictionaries. He brought the Sorbonne down upon him by publishing an Apologie pour Hérodote in 1566, in which he pointed out the parallels between Christian miracles and the incredible marvels related by the Greek. He in his turn sought refuge in Geneva, but found the Calvinist regime as intolerant as the Sorbonne. Many publications of this age were models of typography, engraving, and binding. The heavy half-metallic bindings of the 15th century gave place to lighter and cheaper covers in leather, vellum, or parchment. Jean Grolier de Servières, treasurer of France in 1534, had most of his 3,000 volumes so elegantly bound in Levantine Morocco that they rank among the handsomest books in existence. Private libraries were now numberless, and public libraries were opened in many cities. Krakow in 1517, Hamburg in 1529, Nuremberg in 1538. Under Francis I, the old royal library assembled by Charles VIII was transferred from the Louvre to Fontainebleau, and was enriched with new collections and fine bindings. This Bibliothèque du Roi became, after the Revolution, the Bibliothèque Nationale. Many monastic libraries perished in the Reformation, but many passed into private hands, and what was of value in them found its way into public repositories. Much is lost in history, but so much of worth has been preserved that not 100 lifetimes could absorb it. 2. Schools. It was natural that the Revolution should for a time disrupt the educational system of Western Europe, for that system was almost wholly a service of the Church, and the influence of the Orthodox clergy could not be successfully challenged without breaking their control of education. Luther condemned the existing grammar schools as teaching the student only enough bad Latin to become a priest and read Mass, and yet remain all his life a poor ignoramus fit neither to cackle nor to lay eggs. As for the universities, they seemed to him dens of murderers, temples of Moloch, synagogues of corruption. Nothing more hellish ever appeared on earth or ever would appear, and he concluded that they were only worthy of being reduced to dust. Melanchthon agreed with him on the ground that the universities were turning students into pagans. The opinion of Karlstadt, the Zwickau prophets, and the Anabaptists, that education was a useless frill, a peril to morals, and a hindrance to salvation, was readily accepted by parents who grudged the cost of educating their children. Some fathers argued that since secondary instruction was largely directed to preparing students for the priesthood, and priests were now so unfashionable, it was illogical to send sons to universities. The reformers had expected that the revenues of ecclesiastical properties appropriated by the state would in part be devoted to establishing new schools to replace those that were disappearing with the closing of the monasteries. But princes and lords, Luther complained, were so busily engaged in the high and important affairs of the cellar, the kitchen, and the bedchamber that they had no time to help education. In the German provinces, he wrote in 1524, the schools are now everywhere allowed to go to ruin. By 1530, he and Melanchthon were lamenting the deterioration of the German universities. At Erfurt, the enrollment fell from 311 in 1520 to 120 in 1521 to 34 in 1524. At Rostock, from 300 in 1517 to 15 in 1525. At Heidelberg, in that year, there were more professors than students, and in 1526 only 5 scholars enrolled at the University of Basel. Luther and Melanchthon labored to repair the damage. In an epistle to the burgomasters in 1524, Luther appealed to secular authorities to establish schools. In 1530, far ahead of his time, he proposed that elementary education should be made compulsory and be provided at public expense. To the universities, gradually reconstituted under Protestant auspices, he recommended a curriculum centered on the Bible, but also teaching Latin, Greek, Hebrew, German, law, medicine, history, and poets and orators, heathen or Christian. Melanchthon made the revival of education a main task of his life. Under his leadership and stimulus, many new schools were opened. By the end of the 16th century, there were 300 in Germany. He drew up a Schulplan in 1527 for the organization of schools and universities. He wrote textbooks of Latin and Greek grammar, of rhetoric, logic, psychology, ethics, and theology, and he trained thousands of teachers for the new institutions. His country gratefully named him Praeceptor Germaniae, the educator of Germany. One by one, the universities of northern Germany passed under Protestant control. Wittenberg in 1522, Marburg in 1527, Tübingen in 1535, Leipzig in 1539, Königsberg in 1544, Jena in 1558. Professors or students who, as Duke Ulrich of Württemberg put it, were opposed to the right, true evangelical doctrine were dismissed. Calvinists were excluded from Lutheran colleges, and Protestants were barred from universities still held by Catholics. Generally, after the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, German students were forbidden to attend schools of another faith than that of the territorial prince. Johannes Sturm immensely advanced the new education when he set up a gymnasium, or secondary school, at Strasbourg in 1538, and published in that year an influential tract on rightly opening schools of letters. Like so many leaders of thought in Central Europe, Sturm had received his schooling from the Brethren of the Common Life. Thence he went to Louvain and Paris, where he met Rabelais. The famous Letter of Gargantua on education may echo a mutual influence. While making a wise piety the chief aim of education, Sturm laid rising stress on the study of the Greek and Latin languages and literatures, and this thoroughness of training in the classics passed down to the later Gymnasien of Germany to raise the army of scholars that, in the 19th century, raided and ransacked the ancient world. The schools of England suffered even more than those of Germany from the religious overturn. Cathedral, monastic, guild, and chantry schools melted away in the heat of the attack upon ecclesiastical abuses and wealth. Most university students had been sent up by those schools. This flow ceasing, Oxford graduated only 173 bachelors of arts, Cambridge only 191 in 1548. In 1547 and 1550, Oxford had no such graduates at all. Henry VIII felt the problem, but his need of funds for war or weddings limited him to establishing Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1546, and financing Regius professorships in divinity, Hebrew, Greek, medicine, and law. Private philanthropy in this period founded Corpus Christi College, Christ Church College, St. John's College, and Trinity College at Oxford, and Magdalen College at Cambridge. The Royal Commission sent by Cromwell to Oxford and Cambridge in 1535 to appropriate their charters and endowments for the king brought both faculty and curriculum under government control. The reign of scholasticism in England was summarily ended. The works of Duns Scotus were literally scattered to the winds. Canon law was set aside, Greek and Latin studies were encouraged, the curriculum was largely secularized. But dogmatism remained. A law of 1553 required all candidates for degrees to subscribe to the Anglican Articles of Religion. In Catholic France and Flanders, the universities declined not in endowments or enrollments, but in vigor and freedom of intellectual life. New universities were opened at Reims, Douai, Lille, and Besançon. The University of Louvain rivaled that of Paris in number of students, 5,000, and in defense of an orthodoxy that even the popes found extreme. The University of Paris had a large enrollment, 6,000, but it no longer attracted foreign students in any considerable number, or tolerated, as in its 13th century prime, the quickening ferment of new ideas. Its other faculties were so dominated by that of theology, the Sorbonne, that this name became almost a synonym for the university. The curriculum of theology and expurgated classics seemed to Montaigne a superficial routine of memorizing and conformity. Rabelais never tired of satirizing the scholastic formalities and logical gymnastics of the Sorbonne, the waste of student years in debates carefully removed from actual concern with human life. "I am willing to lose my share of paradise," vowed Clément Marot, "if those great beasts, the professors, did not ruin my youth." All the power and authority of the university were turned not only against the French Protestants, but against the French humanists as well. Francis I, who had drunk the wine of Italy and had met churchmen steeped in the literature of ancient Greece and Rome, did his best to protect French scholarship from the conservative discouragements emanating from the Sorbonne. Urged on by Guillaume Boudet, Cardinal Jean du Bellay, and the indefatigable Marguerite, he provided funds to establish, in 1529, independently of the university, a school devoted predominantly to humanistic studies. 4 royal professors were initially appointed, 2 for Greek, 2 for Hebrew, and chairs of Latin, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy were presently added. Tuition was free. This Collège Royal, later renamed Collège de France, became the warming hearth of French humanism, the home of the free but disciplined mind of France. Spain, though passionately orthodox, had excellent universities, 14 in 1553, including new foundations at Toledo, Santiago, and Granada. That of Salamanca, with 70 professors and 6,778 students in 1584, could bear comparison with any. The universities of Italy continued to flourish. That of Bologna in 1543 had 57 professors in the Faculty of Arts, 37 in law, 15 in medicine, and Padua was the mecca of enterprising students from north of the Alps. Poland testified to its golden age by enrolling 15,338 students at one time in the University of Krakow, and in Poznan the Lubrancianum, founded in 1519 by Bishop John Lubransky, was dedicated to humanistic pursuits. All in all, the universities suffered less in Catholic than in Protestant countries in this cataclysmic century. The importance of the teacher was underestimated, and he was grievously underpaid. The professors at the Collège Royal received 200 crowns a year, or about $5,000, but this was highly exceptional. At Salamanca, the professors were chosen by the students after a trial period of sample lectures by rival candidates. Instruction was mostly by lectures, sometimes brought to life by debates. Note-taking served many a student in place of textbooks. Dictionaries were rare. Laboratories were practically unknown except to alchemists. Students were housed in cheap and poorly heated rooms and became ill on unclean or inadequate food. Many worked their way through college. Classes began at 6 in the morning, ended at 5 in the afternoon. Discipline was rigorous. Even near graduates might be flogged. The students warmed themselves with street brawls and such wine and wenches as they could afford. By one means or another they achieved education, to a degree. Girls of the lower classes remained illiterate. Many of the middle classes found moderate schooling in nunneries. Well-to-do young women had tutors. Holland boasted of several ladies who could be courted in Latin and who could probably conjugate better than they could decline. In Germany, the wife of Peutinger and the sisters and daughters of Pirkheimer were famous for learning. In France, the women around Francis graced their flirtations with classical quotations, and in England, some bluestockings, Moore's daughters, Jane Grey, Bloody Mary, Elizabeth, were paragons of erudition. Two famous teachers belonged to this age. The lesser was Sir Thomas Elyot, whose book named the Governor of 1531 outlined an education by which pedigreed pupils might be fitted for statesmanship. Elyot began by berating the cultural crudity of the English nobles. He contrasted it with the learning credited to men of affairs in ancient Greece and Rome, and quoted Diogenes the Cynic, who, seeing one without learning seated on a stone, remarked, "Behold, where one stone sitteth on another." At 7, the boy should be placed under a carefully selected tutor, who will teach him the elements of music, painting, and sculpture. At 14, he is to be taught cosmography, logic, and history, and is to be trained in wrestling, hunting, shooting with the long bow, swimming, and tennis. Not football, for that is plebeian, and therein is nothing but beastly fury and external violence. The lad is to study the classics at every stage of his education, first the poets, then the orators, then the historians, then the generals, then the philosophers, to which Elyot, as almost an afterthought, adds the Bible, thereby reversing Luther's plan. For despite his protestations, Elyot much prefers the classics to the Bible. Lord God, what incomparable sweetness of words and matter in the works of Plato and Cicero, wherein is joined gravity and delectation, excellent wisdom with divine eloquence, absolute virtue with pleasure incredible, so that those books be almost sufficient to make a perfect and excellent governor. Juan Vives, humanist of the humanists, followed a larger aim and wider course. Born at Valencia in 1492, he left Spain at 17, never to see it again. He studied in Paris long enough to love philosophy and despise scholasticism. At 26, he wrote the first modern history of philosophy, De Initis Sectis et Laudibus Philosophiae. In the same year, he challenged the universities with an attack on scholastic methods of teaching philosophy. The scheme of promoting thought by debates, he felt, promoted only futile wrangling over inconsequential issues. Erasmus hailed the book, recommended it to More, and politely feared that Vives will overshadow Erasmus. Perhaps through Erasmus's influence, Vives was appointed professor of the humanities at Louvain in 1519. Urged on by Erasmus, he published an edition of Augustine's City of God with elaborate commentaries. He dedicated it to Henry VIII and received so cordial a reply that he moved to England in 1523. He was welcomed by More and Queen Catherine, his compatriot, and Henry named him one of Princess Mary's tutors. Apparently for her guidance, he wrote On the Education of Children in 1523. All went well until he expressed disapproval of Henry's plea for a marriage annulment. Henry stopped his salary and put him under house arrest for 6 weeks. Released, Vives returned to Bruges in 1528 and spent there the remaining years of his life. Still idealistic at 37, he dedicated to Charles V an Erasmian appeal for an international court of arbitration as a substitute for war. 2 years later he issued his major work, De Tradendis Disciplinis, on the transmission of studies, the most progressive educational treatise of the Renaissance. He called for an education directed to the necessities of life, to some bodily or mental improvement, to the cultivation and increase of reverence. The pupil should enter school as if into a holy temple, but his studies there should prepare him to be a decent and useful citizen. Those studies should cover the whole of life and should be taught in their interrelation as they function in living. Nature, as well as books, should be studied. Things are more instructive than theories. Let the student note the veins, nerves, bones, and other parts of the body in their anatomy and action. Let him consult farmers, hunters, shepherds, gardeners, and learn their lore. These gleanings will be more useful than the scholastic babblement which has corrupted every branch of knowledge in the name of logic. The classics, expurgated for youth, should remain a vital part of the curriculum, but modern history and geography are to be studied too. The vernaculars as well as Latin should be taught, and all by the direct method of daily use. Vives was so far ahead of his time that it lost sight of him and let him die in poverty. He remained a Catholic to the end. 3. Scholars. The distinctive task of the universities, the academies, and the humanists in the Renaissance was to gather, translate, and transmit the old world of Greece and Rome to the young world of modern Europe. The task was grandly accomplished, and the classic revelation was complete. 2 men remain to be commemorated as oracles of this revelation. Guillaume Boudet, after living 62 years in hopes of making Paris the heir of Italian humanism, came into his own when Francis founded the Collège Royal. He began his adult studies with law, and for almost a decade he buried himself in the Pandects of Justinian. To understand these texts better, Latin in language but Byzantine in bearings, he took up Greek with John Lascaris, and so devotedly that his teacher, departing, bequeathed to him his precious library of Greek books. When at 41 Boudet published Annotationes in 24 Libros Pandectarum, in 1508, the Digest of Justinian, for the first time in Renaissance jurisprudence, was studied in itself and its environment, instead of being displaced by the commentaries of the glossators. 6 years later he issued another monument of recondite research, De Asse et Partibus, on its surface a discussion of ancient coins and measures, but actually an exhaustive consideration of classical literature in relation to economic life. Still more impressive were his Commentarii Linguae Graecae of 1529, a work loosely ordered but so rich in lexicographic information and illumination that it placed Boudet at the head of all European Hellenists. Rabelais sent him a letter of homage. Erasmus paid him the compliment of jealousy. Erasmus was a man of the world to whom scholarship was only a part of life, but to Boudet scholarship and life were one. "It is philology," he wrote, "that has so long been my companion, my associate, my mistress, bound to me by every tie of affection. But I have been forced to loosen the bonds of a love so devouring that I found it destructive to my health." He mourned that he had to steal time from his studies to eat and sleep. In moments of distraction he married and begot 11 children. Jean Clouet's portrait of him, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, shows him in a pessimistic mood, but Francis I must have found some warmth in him, for he made him librarian at Fontainebleau, and liked to have the old scholar near him, even on tours. On one of these Boudet caught a fever. He left precise instructions for an unceremonious funeral, and quietly passed away in 1540. The Collège de France is his monument. Paris had not yet in his time absorbed the intellectual life of France. Humanism had a dozen French hearths, Bourges, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Montpellier, and above all Lyon, where love and humanism, ladies and literature made a delightful mixture. And in Agen, where no one would have looked for an emperor, Julius Caesar Scaliger ruled imperiously over the philological scene after Boudet's death. Born probably at Padua in 1484, he came to Agen at 41 and lived there till his death in 1558. Every scholar feared him, for he had a masterly command of vituperative Latin. He made a name for himself by attacking Erasmus for belittling the Ciceronians, sticklers for a precise Ciceronian Latin. He criticized Rabelais, then criticized Dolay for criticizing Rabelais. In a volume of Exercitationes, he examined Jerome Cardan's De Subtilitate, and undertook to prove that everything affirmed in that book was false, and everything denied in it was true. His De Causis Linguae Latinae was the first Latin grammar based upon scientific principles, and his commentaries on Hippocrates and Aristotle were remarkable for both their style and their contributions to science. Julius had 15 children, one of whom became the greatest scholar of the next generation. His Poeticae, published 4 years after his death, shared with the work of his son, and the influence of the Italians who followed Catherine de Médicis to France, in turning French humanism back from Greek to Latin studies. A special gift of the Greek revival was Amyot's translation of Plutarch's Lives. Jacques Amyot was one of Marguerite's many protégés. Through her, he was appointed to a chair of Greek and Latin at Bourges. His translations of Daphnis and Chloe and other Greek love stories were rewarded, in the genial oddity of the times, with a rich abbey. So secured, he traveled widely in Italy, indulging his antiquarian and philological tastes. When he published the Lives in 1559, he prefaced the book with an eloquent plea for the study of history as the treasure house of humanity, a museum in which 1,000 examples of virtue and vice, statesmanship and decay, are preserved for the instruction of mankind. Like Napoleon, he considered history a better teacher of philosophy than philosophy itself. Nevertheless, he proceeded to translate also Plutarch's Moralia. He was promoted to the bishopric of Auxerre, and died there in the ripeness of 80 years in 1593. His version of the Lives was not always accurate, but it was a work of literature in its own right, endowed with a natural and idiomatic style quite equal to that of the original. Its influence was endless. Montaigne revelled in it, and turned from the France of St. Bartholomew to this select and ennobled antiquity. Shakespeare took 3 plays from North's virile translation of Amyot's translation. The Plutarchian ideal of the hero modeled 100 French dramas and revolutionists, and the Vie des Hommes Illustres gave to the nation a pantheon of celebrities fit to stir the more masculine virtues of the French soul. 4. The French Renaissance. It is customary and forgivable to call by this term, so rich in overtones, the period between the accession of Francis I in 1515 and the assassination of Henry IV in 1610. Essentially, this colorful flowering of French poetry and prose, manners and arts and dress, was less a rebirth than a ripening. By the patient resilience of men and the new growth of the new-seeded earth, the French economy and spirit had recovered from the 100 Years' War. Louis XI had given France a strong, centered, orderly government. Louis XII had given it a fruitful decade of peace. The free, loose, fantastic creativeness of the Gothic age survived, even and most in Rabelais, who so admired the classics that he quoted nearly all of them. But the Great Awakening was also a renaissance. French literature and art were unquestionably affected by a closer acquaintance with ancient culture and classic forms. Those forms, and the classic temper, the predominance of intellectual order over emotional ardor, continued in French drama, poetry, painting, sculpture, and architecture for almost 3 centuries. The fertilizing agents in the new birth were the French discovery and invasion of Italy, the French study of Roman ruins, jurisprudence, and literature, of Italian letters and arts, and the influx of Italian artists and poets into France. To the happy issue, many other factors contributed. Printing, the dissemination and translation of classic texts, the patronage of scholars, poets, and artists by French kings, by their mistresses, by Marguerite of Navarre, by ecclesiastics and aristocrats, and the inspiration of women capable of appreciating other beauties than their own. All these elements came together in the flourishing of France. Francis I, who inherited all this, had as a page the poet who served as a transition from Gothic to classic, from Villon to Renaissance. Clément Marot entered history as a frolicsome lad of 13 who amused the king with jolly tales and sprightly repartees. Some years later Francis smiled upon the youth's adventures and quarrels with all the ladies of Paris, for he agreed with Marot that they were very charming indeed. La Françoise est entière et sans rampeur. Plaisir l'amène au profit ne regarde. Conclusion, qui en parle ou broucarde, Françoise son chef-d'œuvre de nature. The Frenchwoman is flawless and complete. Pleasure leads her. She does not look for profit. To conclude, whatever anyone may say to ridicule them, Frenchwomen are nature's masterpiece. Marot babbled poems like a bubbling spring. They were seldom profound, but often touched with tender sentiment. They were verses of occasion, conversation pieces, ballads, roundels, madrigals, or satires and epistles reminiscent of Horace or Martial. He noted with some pique that women, himself to the contrary notwithstanding, could be more readily persuaded by diamonds than by dithyrambs. When little trollops make their price, and find some moneyed lover bold, who can a sparkling diamond hold before their olive laughing eyes, coac, they fall quite inside out. You laugh? Damn him who here goes wrong, for to that stone virtues belong that would seduce eyes most devout. Such gifts and boons do more avail than beauty prayers or wisdom stayed. They send to sleep the lady's maid, and dogs forget to bark or wail. Closed doors fly open to your will, as if bewitched by magic mind, and eyes that saw become quite blind. Now tell me, do you doubt me still? In 1519, Marot became valet de chambre to Marguerite, and fell in love with her dutifully. Gossip said she returned his moans, but more likely she gave him nothing but religion. He developed a moderate sympathy with the Protestant cause in the intervals of his amour. He followed Francis to Italy, fought like a Bayard at Pavia, had the honor to be captured with his king, and, no ransom being expected for a poet, was released. Back in France, he announced his Protestant ideas so openly that the Bishop of Chartres summoned him and kept him under genteel imprisonment in the episcopal palace. He was set free by Marguerite's intercession, but was soon arrested for helping prisoners to escape from the police. Francis bailed him out and took him to Bayonne to sing the charms of his new bride, Eleanor of Portugal. After another session in jail for eating bacon in Lent, he followed Marguerite to Cahors and Nérac. Presently, the affair of the placards revived the campaign against the French Protestants. News reached Marot that his rooms in Paris had been searched, and that a warrant had gone out for his arrest, this in 1535. Fearful that even Marguerite's skirts would not suffice to hide him, he fled to Italy, to the Duchess Renée in Ferrara. She welcomed him as if a reborn Virgil had arrived from Mantua, and perhaps she knew that he liked to link his name with that of Publius Virgilius Maro. He resembled more the light-hearted amorous Ovid, or his favorite Villon, whose poems he edited and whose life he relived. When Duke Ercole II let it be known that he was surfeited with Protestants, Clement moved on to Venice. Word reached him that Francis had offered pardon to abjuring heretics. Marot, thinking the ladies of Paris worth a mass, abjured. The king gave him a house and garden, and Clement tried to be a bourgeois gentilhomme. François Vétable, who was teaching Hebrew in the Collège Royal, asked him to translate the Psalms into French verse, and expounded them to him word for word. Marot put 30 of them into melodious poetry, and published them with a judicious dedication to the king. Francis liked them so much that he gave a special copy to Charles V, who was momentarily his friend. Charles sent the poet 200 crowns, or about $5,000. Marot translated more of the Psalms and issued them in 1543 with a dedication to his first love, the ladies of France. Goudimel put them to music, as we have seen, and half of France began to sing them. But as Luther and Calvin also liked them, the Sorbonne suspected them of Protestantism, or perhaps in the ordeal of success Marot had remumbled his heresies. The campaign against him was renewed. He fled to Geneva, but found the theological climate there too severe for his health. He slipped into Italy and died in Turin in 1544 at the age of 49, leaving an illegitimate daughter to the care of the Queen of Navarre. 5. Rabelais. 1. Himself. The unique, inexhaustible, skeptical, hilarious, learned, and obscene author of the most diverting and most profitable stories which have ever been told burst into the world in 1495, son of a prosperous notary at Chinon. He was entered at too early an age into a Franciscan monastery. He complained later that women who carry children 9 months beneath their hearts cannot bear to suffer them 9 years, and by simply adding an L to their dress and cutting I know not how many hairs from the top of their head, by means of certain words they turn them into birds. That is, they tonsure them and make them monks. The boy accepted his fate because he was inclined to study, and probably, like Erasmus, he was drawn to the books in the monastic library. He found there 2 or 3 other monks who wished to study Greek, and who were excited by the vast ancient world that scholarship was revealing. Francois made such progress that he received a letter of praise from Boudet himself. Matters seemed to be going well, and in 1520 the future doubter was ordained a priest. But some older monks scented heresy in philology. They accused the young Hellenists of buying books with the fees they received for preaching, instead of handing the money over to the common treasury. Rabelais and another monk were put in solitary confinement, and were deprived of books which were to them half of life. Boudet, apprised of this contretemps, appealed to Francis I, who ordered the scholars reinstated in freedom and privileges. Some further intercession brought a papal rescript permitting Rabelais to change his monastic allegiance and residence. He left the Franciscans and entered a Benedictine house at Maizet in 1524. There the bishop, Geoffroy d'Estissac, took such a fancy to him that he arranged with the abbot that Rabelais should be allowed to go wherever he wished for his studies. Rabelais went, and forgot to return. After sampling several universities, he entered the School of Medicine at Montpellier in 1530. He must have had some prior instruction, for he received the degree of Bachelor of Medicine in 1531. For reasons unknown, he did not proceed to earn the doctorate, but resumed his wandering until, in 1532, he settled down in Lyon. Like Servetus, he combined the practice of medicine with scholarly pursuits. He served as editorial aide to the printer Sebastian Griffius, edited several Greek texts, translated the aphorisms of Hippocrates into Latin, and was willingly caught in the humanistic stream then in full flow at Lyon. On November 30th, 1532, he dispatched a copy of Josephus to Erasmus with a letter of adulation, strange in a man of 37, but savoring of that enthusiastic age. Georges d'Armagnac recently sent me Flavius Josephus's history, and asked me to send it to you. I have eagerly seized this opportunity, O humanest of fathers, to prove to you by grateful homage my profound respect for you and my filial piety. My father, did I say? I should call you mother, did your indulgence allow it. All that we know of mothers, who nourish the fruit of their wombs before seeing it, before even knowing what it will be, who protect it, who shelter it against the inclemency of the air, that you have done for me whose face was not known to you, and whose obscure name could not impress you. You have brought me up, you have fed me at the chaste breasts of your divine knowledge. All that I am worth, I owe to you alone. If I did not publish it aloud, I should be the most ungrateful of men. Salutations once more, beloved father, honor of your country, support of letters, unconquerable champion of truth. In that same November, 1532, we find Rabelais a physician in the Hôtel Dieu, or city hospital of Lyon, with a salary of 40 livres, or $1,000 a year. But we must not think of him as a typical scholar or physician. It is true that his learning was varied and immense. Like Shakespeare, he seems to have had professional knowledge in a dozen fields: law, medicine, literature, theology, cookery, history, botany, astronomy, mythology. He refers to 100 classic legends, quotes half 100 classic authors. Sometimes he parades his erudition amateurishly. He was so busy living that he had no time to achieve meticulous accuracy in his scholarship. The editions that he prepared were not models of careful detail. It was not in his character to be a dedicated humanist like Erasmus or Boudet. He loved life more than books. He is pictured for us as a man of distinguished presence, tall and handsome, a well of learning, a light and fire of conversation. He was not a toper, as an old tradition wrongly inferred from his salutes to drinkers and his paeans to wine. On the contrary, except for one little bastard, who lived so briefly as to be only a venial sin, he led a reasonably decent life, and was honored by the finest spirits of his time, including several dignitaries of the Church. At the same time, he had in him many qualities of the French peasant. He relished the bluff and hearty types that he met in the fields and streets. He enjoyed their jokes and laughter, their tall tales and boastful ribaldry. And unwittingly he made Erasmus's fame pale before his own, because he collected and connected these stories, improved and expanded them, dignified them with classic lore, lifted them into constructive satire, and carefully included their obscenity. One story, then current in many rural areas, told of a kindly giant named Gargantua. His cavernous appetite, his feats of love and strength. Here and there were hills and boulders which, said local traditions, had dropped from Gargantua's basket as he passed. Such legends were still told as late as 1860 in French hamlets that had never heard of Rabelais. An unknown writer, perhaps Rabelais himself as a tour de rire, jotted some of the fables down and had them printed in Lyon as the great and inestimable chronicles of the great and enormous giant Gargantua. This in 1532. The book sold so readily that Rabelais conceived the idea of writing a sequel to it about Gargantua's son. So at the Lyon Fair of October 1532 there appeared anonymously the horrible and dreadful deeds and prowesses of the most renowned Pantagruel. This name had been used in some popular dramas, but Rabelais gave the character new content and depth. The Sorbonne and the monks condemned the book as obscene, and it sold well. Francis I enjoyed it, some of the clergy relished it. Not till 14 years later did Rabelais admit his authorship. He feared to endanger, if not his life, his reputation as a scholar. He was still so wedded to scholarship that he neglected his duties at the hospital and was dismissed. He might have had trouble buttering his bread had not Jean du Bellay, Bishop of Paris and co-founder of the Collège de France, taken Rabelais with him as physician on a mission to Italy in January 1534. Returning to Lyon in April, Rabelais published there in October The Very Horrible Life of the Great Gargantua, Father of Pantagruel. This second volume, which was later to form Book 1 of the full work, contained such rollicking satires of the clergy that it won another Sorbonnian condemnation. Soon the two stories, published together, outsold every publication in France except the Bible and the Imitation of Christ. Again, we are told, King Francis laughed and applauded. But on the night of October 17th to 18th, 1534, the posting of insulting Protestant placards on Paris buildings and the king's own doors changed him from a protector of humanists into a persecutor of heretics. Rabelais had again concealed his authorship, but it was widely suspected, and he had good reason to fear that the Sorbonne, carrying the king in its train, would demand the scandalous writer's head. Again Jean du Bellay came to his rescue. Now a cardinal, the genial churchman snatched the endangered scholar-physician pornographer out of his Lyon den and took him to Rome in 1535. It was Rabelais' luck to find there an enlightened pope. Paul III forgave him his neglect of his monastic and priestly duties and gave him permission to practice medicine. As amende honorable, Rabelais expunged from future editions of his now double-backed book the passages most offensive to orthodox taste. And when Etienne Dolet played a trick on him by publishing, without permission, an unexpurgated edition, he crossed him from the roster of his friends. Under the protection of the cardinal, he studied again at Montpellier, received the doctorate in medicine, lectured to large audiences there, and then returned to Lyon to resume his life as physician and scholar. In June 1537, Dolet described him as conducting an anatomy lesson by dissecting an executed criminal before an assemblage of students. Thereafter, we know only snatches of his undulant career. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.